Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Doing good, thank you.
Good.
Want to talk about a mess that's been going on since a little bit before January 6th.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out, and of course, they announced this week or last week that there'd be a hearing today, and it would start sorting things out and find out and get to the bottom of all the controversy about who started what and who was responsible and why weren't the troops there and why did Nancy Pelosi not seem to assume her responsibility and why was it all Trump's fault, this sort of thing. The announcement was Congress finally gets first chance for answers about the January 6th insurrection. So they already have it, and so far, as expected, we didn't expect an answer, and Daniel will make a comment on that in a minute. But we also want to talk about something else. To me, the most controversial thing going on this whole analysis and understanding is all the misinformation during the so-called riots and what were going on. And I think what they say there were four people or five people killed, and
or died, not killed. Yeah.
Yeah, died, and they were all because of Trump, and because of the riots, and they were at fault. But there was one that stood out because I guess it was a policeman, one of Trump's friends, because he brags about how close he is to the police. And they have this story, and I think good people want to believe people that are in the business of passing out news. But the story that lasted for weeks, even it still exists, that an over-exuberant supporter and policeman killed this policeman with a fire extinguisher. And of course, fortunately, we have had somebody look into this for us and everybody else who will look. A friend of ours, and that's Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah.
And he's written a long article on explaining this. And Glenn is not a Democrat. I don't think he calls himself a libertarian. He might. He doesn't call himself a Republican. Yeah. He doesn't call himself an anti-Trumper. He doesn't call him a pro-Trump. You know what he is? He's a journalist. Yeah. And that's why people who are starved for honesty and reporting can really like what Glenn does. And so he's written this long article. He's the one that lost his website after he started it because he wasn't he wasn't harsh enough on Trump, and he didn't admit, like all the other people he brought together, they were voting for Biden, so they more or less kicked him out. Yeah. So he's on his own, but he doesn't even need to be kicked out of anything because he's always on his own and he's always reporting. And this article he's written, and you'll tell us a little bit more about that, is the title is "The False and Exaggerated Claims Still Being Spread About the Capitol Riot." And he has a job to do, but if we could get more people to read Glenn Greenwald, especially on this explanation. And I'm even amazed at looking into this in the last couple of days to find out that this had this was written up and detailed in this killing. Well, not the killing, the way this policeman died, is something that just is astounding that this happened. And Glenn looks into this, but it was used in the impeachment proceedings.
Yeah.
And this was, but the inference there was if they were using it against Trump.
Yeah.
And of course, the falsehoods in reporting, I think the greatest amount of falsehood that promoted this story, would you agree, probably was the New York Times.
Yeah, they're the ones that broke the story that Brian Sicknick, who was a Capitol Hill police officer, had been murdered with a fire extinguisher by the Trump mob. And Greenwald starts his article with a very good point. He says, condemning the riot does not allow, let alone require, echoing false claims in order to render the event more menacing and serious than it actually was. His point is you could certainly condemn what happened, and he does very explicitly in the beginning of his article, but then he goes on to pick apart all of the false claims. And I think he starts with the Sicknick story because that is the most serious, because the media wanted to have a narrative that this was an organized, armed insurrection to overthrow the government and, I don't know, keep Trump in power or something. In order to do that, and I'm paraphrasing what Greenwald is pointing out, you needed to have this kind of killing. You needed to show that the mob was armed and violent and ready to kill police officers. The problem is the New York Times ran with this article about Officer Sicknick with really no evidence. Two unnamed police officers or law enforcement sources was all they had. And then, of course, they had to put up the headline, "He dreamed of being a police officer. Then he was killed by a pro-Trump mob." And that narrative continued even after the story had been debunked. And even to this day, the Politico article that we based the beginning of our show on, it still says, it doesn't say it was shown to be false. It says still not confirmed that he was killed by a fire extinguisher, even though his own brother said he wasn't killed that day. I talked to him that night. He said he was fine, had been pepper sprayed, wasn't so happy about that, but he was fine. And the next day he was dead, and then immediately he was cremated. And now I guess you can't do any more investigations on what caused him to die. But there are other things we'll go into. But his point is, you've got to correct a false narrative, and that doesn't mean that you condone what happened, or you think it was nifty.
He's very specific about that. He's precise. He says, in fact, should not make them an apologist for the rioters.
Yeah.
But that's what happens, you know, if you start talking this way, then you say, oh, you guys don't even care. I mean, they do that, you know, with COVID and everything else.
Yeah.
If you bring up any factual information, oh, you don't care about somebody getting killed. So that's what they do to people who want to report. But I don't think the motivation is there. I mean, I don't see anybody writing things and not being heard that would follow, you know, some of the practices of Glenn Greenwald. But they're out there, and they need a little encouragement. We need some people that are willing to be true journalists and not be influenced. That's why I think anybody with a libertarian leaning should be more receptive to this, because they're not partisan. But matter of fact, Republicans and Democrats aren't anxious to talk to just libertarians, because they will evenly diagnose this and say Republicans and Democrats do it, which we do frequently on this program.
Yeah.
So this is and the thing that you mentioned, I think, is most astounding and disgraceful is, you know, the description that Glenn talks about him being alive and talking to his brother, and then before you knew it, he was cremated.
Yeah,
so
weird.
But it could have been, you know, a heart attack or something like that. Yeah. I don't think anybody's using it murder other than the implication that Trump supporters killed him. You know, that's what they want you to be left with. And that's where the real crisis comes from, because it's false information and it carries a day. Even today, you know, it was a big story. It was mentioned during the impeachment hearings, but today, you know, it's old-fashioned. People aren't that interested in it. We'd like to call attention to as many people as possible for them to look at it, and a good place to start would be to read Greenwald.
Yeah, it is a good piece, and he goes into some of the other narratives that are so important, false narratives, it turns out. And one was the guy with the zip ties. He was photographed with a big old thing of zip ties, and this was used to bolster the claims of people like Alexandria Cortez, that she was fearing for her life, and they tried to kill us all. They wanted to come into our offices and handcuff us and kill us and murder us. Well, it turns out that he didn't come there with zip ties at all. He had actually seen a bunch of those lying on a table, and he didn't want them to be distributed or get around, so he actually picked them up. They were Capitol Hill Police zip ties that he picked up. And the other thing is that Greenwald really takes apart is the whole notion of an armed insurrection, because those two words together are critical. But as he points out, this is a legal term as well as a political term, and it's one of the most serious crimes you could commit, an armed insurrection against your own government. But this is what's interesting, that he said, at least from what is known publicly, there is no evidence of a single protester wielding, let alone using, a firearm inside the Capitol on that day. Earlier, he had pointed out that this is the most surveilled building, you know, probably in Washington, yet there's no video evidence that we've seen. And he said, as indicated, the only person to have been shot was a pro-Trump protester killed by a Capitol Hill police officer. So a lot of this narrative was weaved together in these stories and repeated ad nauseum by the mainstream media. But under even the most rudimentary scrutiny, the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing falling apart doesn't excuse what happened again, but they're using it to crack down and have this whole new war against quote-unquote domestic terrorists.
And it started right away. The impeachment hearings, they knew that would come up. And here's a quote from Greenwald's article. He's saying, quote, Capitol Police, no, this is New York Times, Capitol Police officer dies from injury in pro-Trump rampage.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, well, that's not true.
Yeah,
It's just not true. But my comment to myself here was, that's the real, incitement.
Yeah.
That's what really is incited. But this is almost incitement after the fact. It already occurred, but it was the justification for the incitement. And they had to do Trump because the evidence was so flimsy. You know, they just didn't have the evidence, and they're still struggling, and yet this is the type of attitude that existed before, afterwards, and continues, of course.
Yeah, well, you know, any time the independent media moves or breathes, you've got organizations like PolitiFact that are coming in and fact-checking everything. Why are they not fact-checking the people that are still to this day making the claims about the fire extinguisher? Why didn't they fact-check Biden when he said in a statement after the impeachment that Officer Sicknick lost his life protecting the Capitol from a violent mob? Why don't they fact check that? Well, because they're not fact checkers. What they are is fact creators. But going back to sort of the news tie with what we wanted to talk about, the first round of hearings did take place this morning. We didn't learn a whole lot, but we learned a few interesting things. First of all, former Capitol Hill Police Chief Stephen Sund, he pointed out he claims now in his statement there was an hours-long delay by the Pentagon in deploying the National Guard. That's what he claims. He was pleading for aid. He blamed Lieutenant General Walter Pyatt. He said it would not be good optics to send in the military, and so he hesitated. And here's interesting. This kind of makes you wonder, considering what we just said about what Greenwald blew apart this idea. Here's what Soon said in his testimony today. No police force is trained and equipped to repel an insurrection of thousands of armed, violent, coordinated individuals. I think that statement needs kind of a fact check too, which we won't see. But the conflict is interesting, and that is the House Sergeant at Arms, former, because I think one quit and one was fired, Paul Irving. And Paul Irving conflicted in his testimony with the Capitol Hill Police Chief. Soon, the Capitol Hill Police Chief said that he called Irving begging for help, begging for backup. And Irving said, he never called me. I checked my phone records. There's no evidence of his call. So it raises a lot more questions, really, than it solves right now. And it sounds like former Police Chief Sund is trying to cover his rear end or something like this. So
I want to read another thing in Greenwald's article dealing with Sicknick. He says they had to blame Trump. I mean, that was the big thing to justify all this going on. He said, it took on such importance, this whole episode, this incident, for a clear reason. Sicknick's death was the only example the media had of the pro-Trump mob deliberately killing anyone.
Yeah.
I don't even know, I haven't seen one record that they even found a gun.
Not even a single.
There were no guns there. And they're talking about the insurrection to take over the government, and who knows how many people might have been involved there that probably never voted for Trump and wasn't at the rally.
Yeah. Well, and I think it was CNN that paid one of the people who has been indicted for promoting the violence there. They paid him $70,000 for his video footage inside. Turns out he's a far left-wing activist who went in there and tried to get people to become more violent and videotaped it as they were becoming more violent. And then he gets $70,000 from CNN to sell the footage. But some of the questions that should be answered that won't be answered or even asked. What was the relationship between Pelosi, who is in charge of the House Sergeant at Arms, and McConnell, who has the same responsibility on the Senate side as being the leader of the majority in the House and the Speaker of the House? What kinds of discussions did they have with the Sergeant at Arms? What was going on there? What were the directions? Did they not have intelligence suggesting that this might happen? and why did they not act on it? It'll be interesting to see if they want to go ahead and blame the Pentagon completely for holding back. We know that Trump offered troops, I think, a couple days before, and that didn't happen. So I don't know if these are going to come out, because it might get a little bit close to the people that still are in power. It might be that former police chief Soon is going to have to fall on his sword or something.
Yes. You know, the disappointing thing is that if a two-party system is supposed to work and there'd be a little bit of a contest, that you wouldn't expect the Republican leaders in the Senate and elsewhere to endorse these stories about the police officer, being hit with fire extinguishers. There's too many of them just bought into this, even though the numbers are still there, that they're questioning this. I think people are starting to realize, but just think of how people who question anything, how that's happened, with coronavirus. If you question it at all, boy, you can be made to look bad. You don't care, you don't care about rioters, you don't care about people who are sick and this sort of thing. But what we care about is trying to find the truth and help those who are seeking it out to reveal it to us. But the other thing that I've cautioned from the very beginning of my immediate reaction was, let's hope it works. Let's try to put pressure on them. Let's hope we find more people that will be willing to stand up for what is right, rather than just deciding what the issue is and this is what we do here. And Congress, I just don't think the so-called investigation, the hearings, they're going to have some follow-up hearings. But I just don't, if they're able to put this garbage, in the impeachment challenges, in the material they gave to justify the impeachment, believe me, it can go anywhere. And then if you have the New York Times and everybody else pounding it away, but there are still others out there doing some others, and the people who are seeking the truth, they can find it, but they might have to do a little searching, and they have to be a little bit more questioning. Once they hear something, they just say, I wonder if that's true or not. Let's check the source.
And nobody ever reads the correction. The big headlines, officer killed, no one's going to read it, page A23. Well, actually, it didn't happen that way. I think if you probably went out and surveyed people who had heard of it, they probably would still believe the New York Times version. But I think, do you feel like, should we move on now, Dr. Paul?
Yeah, we should.
Because we have a few things to cover, and we're running short on time here.
Oh, boy.
But this is something that came to our attention yesterday, very disturbing. 2 examples of the administration and Congress really at war against the First Amendment, at war against free speech. And the first was a letter from 2 California Democrats, and they sent this letter to AT&T, Verizon, Roku, Amazon, Apple, Comcast, Charter, Dish, Cox, et cetera, all of the cable carriers, all the entertainment providers. And essentially what they were asking is, why are you carrying conservative media? You need to get rid of it. You need to shut it down. Here's what they said in their letter. What moral, just wait for a second on that, please. What moral or ethical principles, including those related to journalistic integrity, do you apply in deciding which channels you carry? And later on they said, are you still planning to carry Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN? And Michael Tracy, who's also, like Greenwald, a very independent-minded person, he tweeted this. Let's put that back up if we can. He tweeted this about it, and I think he does a good job. 2 Democratic members of Congress are pressuring the CEOs of the country's major TV providers to essentially purge the news networks these members don't like, on the basis of the alleged danger posed by, quote, misinformation and conspiracy theories. So these are 2 members of Congress pushing these private companies to restrict speech. If that is not as close as you can get to destroying the First Amendment, I don't know what is.
And systematically, they've been attacking language and meanings of words for a long time, and it's the political correctness issue. That's on, and of course, if you don't do it, then they cancel you, and they do all kinds. I'm amazed at how many business people go along. Okay, he's a bad guy. Don't ever hire him again. And the business people just capitulate. And I can't believe they all endorse that thing. They're sort of making a for them, they're probably saying this is pragmatic. It's not worth fighting. We got to go along with this, and they do. But it is such a shame because of how many people go along with this stuff. But I think the attack on the First Amendment is a big deal, and the attack on the understanding on how the competition will be permitted, and how the special advantages to the social media is diminished, because I still believe they have a lot of advantages that people don't realize it, and they're too close to government. They're part of crony capitalism, as far as I'm concerned, and it's a corporatism that I think is dangerous. I am going to go on to.
I have one more little thing on that,
okay.
because Twitter is kind of a sewer in many ways. There's one decent thing about it, is it forces people at times to focus and be very succinct. And so I wanted to put up a tweet that I saw earlier today. David Sachs wrote this tweet. If we can put up that next clip. How to repeal the First Amendment. 1, place media distribution in the hands of a corporate oligopoly. 2, threaten to break them up unless they control disinformation. 3, define disinformation as speech you don't like. Easy. And Dave Rubin, who's very good, as you know, he titles it The Outsourcing of Tyranny. And I think that's really a great title for everything that's happening here. They're outsourcing tyranny.
They're actually telling the truth
about
what they want to do.
Yeah, he was criticizing.
Oh, I know, but on target, because these people, and that bothers me. Sometimes the sneaky stuff means, well, they're a little bit frightened. There's a little bit of opposition, but they go and do it, and people don't seem to care that much. But we don't know exactly the final conclusion of that. We want to get people to start caring.
Yes.
Going to go on and talk about our favorite doctor. Yes. I mean, our least favorite doctor. Dr. Fauci, because one thing that we hit him on over the year or so has been his flip-flopping back and forth. One says one thing one day and says something the next. And it came out yesterday or so. We said, well, he had the statement that where they're lightening up, and herd immunity is there coming by April. But all of a sudden, now this one comes up. This is not too dramatic, but it just makes the point. Fauci says he sees the U.S. CDC relaxing some of COVID-19 guidelines soon. In one sense, he says you're going to be wearing your mask for another year, all year, and you're going to wear it until 2003 or 4, and just forever. And before you know it, there could be another virus. So he's at it to keep us on our toes.
Yeah, he is. And if we can pull up that clip, it's actually not the next one, but the following one. I got a little bit out of order. Not the DeSantis one, but the one that's Fauci. If you go, there we go. So this is the article that you sent over this morning, Dr. Paul, and a couple of things jumped out at me when he said this. On the one hand, he seems to be conceding that there's going to be some relaxation of these recommendations. But listen to this. He says, aimed at curtailing its spread, these relaxations will be, quote, for people who have been vaccinated. And he says you can get together with your family when people have been vaccinated. This is something new that he's throwing in that I think is insidious, and it's dangerous, and it's something that's very frightening. The Israelis are doing it now, which is a real nightmare. They're, ironically, we talked about it last week, forcing people to have these green badges to show they've been vaccinated. He is basically laying the groundwork for a vaccine passport. Oh yeah, you can take your mask off, maybe if you can prove you're vaccinated. Oh, maybe you can go to the mall, maybe you can fly, maybe you can do this or that if you show you've been vaccinated. This is where he's starting to stake his territory, and I think he needs to be shot down.
But this is getting more difficult than ever because, in the old days, if you had a vaccination, you could test and see if you have antibodies.
Yeah.
But the claim now is you cannot definitely identify antibodies if you've been vaccinated. So what does that mean? That means you have to have a government certificate.
Yeah.
And it is just so outrageous that I sure hope people wake up to this effect and start doing what some have already, resist. There has to be some resistance. That's the only thing they'll listen to. They will not listen to, a scientific argument, unfortunately. And there are two sides. We should hear two sides, but we should allow the people to make their decision. They shouldn't be told on which side they have to believe. That's where the real crime is.
Yeah, it is.
So
we move on to our favorite governor.
Yes.
Can we go back?
Ron DeSantis, he has a good name.
Yeah. Can we go back to the one before that just to throw this up here? This is a kind of a good news story, Dr. Paul, and you noticed this, so I'll let you kick it off.
Well, the whole thing is he's a newcomer. He hasn't been there very long. He and I, overlapped a little bit. As I was leaving, he was coming in, and of course I've known about him. But he was, he was sort of the extra guy down there because the conservatives had Rubio and also Scott.
Yeah.
But their credentials must not have been overly solid, because guess what? Floridians love DeSantis, and people outside his state likes him too. So that's I think that's good news. And I got to thinking about it when we were talking. I said, why is it? Because he's not going, and we like him.
Yeah.
But we know he's not, a hardcore libertarian. He's going to agree on everything. And why does he get the support? And my answer was, he stands for something.
Yes.
And thinking about it, a simple statement, but I think I understood that pretty well when I was in office, because I had a lot of people would tell me, well, I don't know, I don't even know anything about the Fed. I don't really care about the Fed, but I know you stand for something, and you'll stick to your guns, and you're trustworthy. And then they say, well, we like this, but we we trust what you're saying. The other stuff is less important, because they figured that you'll do the best thing. I think that's what DeSantis comes across as. He's trustworthy. He believes in something.
Yeah.
He'll be trusted. So often, other people. One time after one of the debates, the Constitution came up, and some young people came up to me, and we were crowded around. They were talking about, and they just loved the fact that I defended the Constitution. I defended the Constitution, and I looked up. I said, so and so, he said he believes in the Constitution. So and so. So he says he cited the Constitution. I said, why is it different? He says, we didn't believe them. I thought that was very encouraging. So I think standing for something is very important. And when you stand with a certain principle, then it broadens the horizon. If you stand for the principle of not initiating violence against anybody, no lying, cheating, stealing, and killing, all of a sudden you find your answers.
And that reminds me of some stories that you tell about how the other members would come up to you. How are you so good at raising money? How come you're so popular? Well, it's because you stood for something. You weren't, putting your finger to the wind. And that sort of reminds me of contrasting someone like DeSantis, who stands for something. Not only that, but he's not afraid to get out there and take some big hits, because everyone hates him because he's successful. Contrast that to our own governor, unfortunately, who does stick his finger up to the wind and is not showing any leadership at all. But I would do a couple quick closers. This goes back to Fauci. If we can just do the next clip, actually, I'll just go through these three really quickly. Some weird news and some good news. This is Biden's spokesperson. She says we're going to have months of sacrifice and suffering and masks before the pandemic ends. Darkness is here. It's going to be going on for months. This is what she said yesterday. But let's look at the actual numbers again. We did it yesterday, but let's look at, does this look like months of darkness and agony and masks when you look at what's happening with the daily new cases? I think somebody has been given the script. Now, my final comment, Dr. Paul, and I haven't showed this to you first because I wanted to give you some good news for my final words. Just look at that last clip. I think this is good news. I like this, and I'd love to see this happen in Texas. North Dakota House passes bill prohibiting mask mandates. So the House of Representatives in North Dakota passed a bill saying, no way, this is ridiculous, no more mask mandates now or in the future. Of course, they're being condemned as well. But I consider that good news. At least some of these state legislatures are waking up. I wish it would happen in Texas.
See, and that's written correctly. It wasn't, you can't use a mask. It says that you can't force me to wear a mask.
Exactly.
And that's the reason why a position defending liberty solves so many problems, because you're doing things voluntarily. You can wear masks or whatever, as long as you don't interfere with the liberties of another person. But that's probably a little bit too simple for some people to grasp. It has to be more complicated because, I just invested a lot of money in my member who represents me, and I've invested this money on. I say, you mean he wouldn't have anything to do? He can't sort it all out. Anything, I want to close by just emphasizing how important it is getting to the truth of things. And right now we talked today a lot about getting to the truth about what happened on January 6th. But that's going to go on for a long time. You're going to hear about it in Washington. But right now, 98% of the things that have been put out there by anything official, political or in the media, has been that you-know-who is the cause of everything. And the blame has to be placed on the Trump administration and the Trump people, the Trump supporters. And that's not to say that because we take a position of seeking the truth, if the truth is uncomfortable for you, that doesn't mean that you have the right to turn it around and say we believe in something or that we're endorsing some bad ideas. That's not right. If you're looking for the truth, you want to find out. And I think we touched on a few of those things today, because actually in looking over things for me to prepare for this, I learned some things about what was known at the time and how complex this became, even though it wasn't. But there's a lot of misinformation. And it's moving more quickly. I remember when they were moving toward invading Iraq. And it was a year or so. I mean, 9/11 was 01, and I think they invaded Afghanistan. So I had to justify going into Afghanistan, and it was over and over and over again. And the lies were piled up. We compiled the lies, and finally the people, changed the position, because the people were opposed to the war. They said, stay out of it. We don't need to go in there. But by the time it happened, they had painted the pictures, the demagoguing the issue, that they found their Hitler. And but things move more quickly now. They've been able to do this rather fast, just since January 6th, to place all the blame falsely on those who weren't responsible for it. So this is, an invitation to say that if the truth gets out, it may be able to switch it and turn it around, and people say, yes, we have a group of people that we know and we can trust, just like in Florida. They have a governor now in Florida they evidently trust, and that's the most important issue they have. So when you find the people that you trust, you got to encourage them. They're around. We talk about one or two and we complain they're not enough, but they're around. You need to encourage it and give them the support that they need. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.